I'm Eliora Mirelle, 23 years old. Until 3 months ago, I believed that hard work and truth would always win in the end. Then a plagiarism accusation destroyed my entire future in a single afternoon. My scholarship vanished. My graduation was canceled, and my reputation became a campus joke overnight. Professor Radley Quentis looked me straight in the eye and said, "Miss Mirelle, perhaps you should have considered the consequences before taking shortcuts." What he didn't know was that I had been working 3 jobs while maintaining a 3.9 GPA for 4 years straight, never once asking for help or special treatment. The worst part wasn't losing my degree or my future. It was the way everyone looked at me afterward, like I was exactly what they'd always expected me to be. Just another poor girl who couldn't make it honestly. But what if I told you the person who actually plagiarized that thesis was sitting in the front row during my humiliation, smirking? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the Millbridge University library hummed their familiar tune as I sat hunched over my laptop at 2:47 a.m., fingers cramped from typing. This had been my second home for 4 years, this corner table by the poetry section where the heating vent kept me warm. During those endless winter nights when I couldn't afford to keep the heat on in my studio apartment, my thesis, Digital Narratives and Modern Identity, How Technology Reshapes Personal Truth, represented 18 months of research, countless interviews, and more coffee than any human should consume. The pages were dog-eared from constant revision, margins filled with my scribbled thoughts in purple ink, my signature color since freshman year. I'd grown up in the apartment, above grandmother's old bookstore on Maple Street, where the smell of aging paper and lavender tea created a sanctuary from the chaos of my mother's 3 jobs and endless worry. Eliora Mirelle had sacrificed her art school dreams to raise me alone after my father disappeared when I was 2. She taught me that education was the only way out, but also that people like us needed to be twice as good to get half as much. Stay invisible, work harder than everyone else, and maybe they'll let you succeed. She'd whisper while helping me with homework at the kitchen table, her waitress uniform still smelling of French fries and disappointment, but I wanted more than invisibility. Literature had saved me stories of women who fought back, who demanded to be heard, who refused to accept the limitations others placed on them. My thesis explored how digital platforms are giving voice to the voiceless, how technology was democratizing storytelling in ways that traditional gatekeepers couldn't control. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to become a victim of those very gatekeepers. Reed Carmine occupied the table across from mine, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he worked on his computer science project. We'd shared this space for 2 years now, developing the comfortable silence of fellow night owls. Reed came from a military family, structured and disciplined, but something about late-night library sessions brought out his gentler side. "You're going to burn a hole through that screen," he said softly, not looking up from his code. "Final revisions?" I murmured back. "Dr. Hendricks wants it first thing Monday." Reed's family had money, not wealthy, but comfortable enough that he didn't work 3 jobs like I did. His father was a colonel, his mother a nurse practitioner. They'd paid for his education outright, but Reed never flaunted it. He understood that privilege came with responsibility, even if he didn't always know how to use it. "Want me to proofread it one more time?" he offered, finally meeting my eyes. I almost said yes. Reed had an excellent eye for detail, and his feedback had strengthened several of my earlier papers. But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying the weight of my entire family's hopes on my shoulders. "Thanks, but I think it's ready," I said, hitting save for the 100th time that night. The next morning, I printed my thesis at the campus copy center, watching my bank balance drop by another $12 I couldn't really afford. 147 pages of my best work, bound in blue covers because they were 50 cents cheaper than Black Dot Professor Radley Quentis' office occupied a corner of Morrison Hall, with tall windows overlooking the quad and walls lined with first edition classics. Quentis had been department head for 8 years, beloved by students and faculty alike for his passionate lectures on American literature and his ability to secure major donations for the program. At 51, he moved through the university. Like royalty, his silver hair perfectly styled, his handshakes firm and confident. Students competed for spots in his seminars, and his recommendation letters were golden tickets to graduate programs across the country. "Miss Mirelle?" he said warmly as I knocked on his doorframe. "Right on time." His office smelled of leather. An expensive coffee, a sharp contrast to the instant packets I lived on. Behind his desk hung a photograph of him shaking hands with a state senator, and another showing him receiving some prestigious teaching award. "I'm excited to read this," he continued, accepting my thesis with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. "Your work on digital narratives has been consistently impressive." I felt a flutter of hope in my chest. Professor Quentis's approval meant everything, not just for my grade, but for my future. Graduate school applications, recommendation letters, academic conferences, they all hinged on moments like this. "Thank you, Professor. I really pushed myself on this one." "I can see that. The dedication shows." He set the bound pages carefully on his desk, next to a stack of other student submissions. "I'll have feedback for you by Friday." Walking across campus that Monday afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in months. Spring was finally breaking through the last stubborn patches of snow, and students lounged on the quad in shorts and tank tops, soaking up the sunshine. For the first time since freshman year, I allowed myself to imagine a future beyond survival. Maybe graduate school was possible. Maybe I could become Professor Mirelle someday, mentoring first-generation students like myself. Maybe my mother could finally stop working 3 jobs and pursue her art again. That evening, I called Mom from my apartment, perched on the edge of my second-in couch with a cup of ramen balanced on my knees. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice thick with exhaustion. She was between shifts at the diner and the overnight cleaning job. "Good, I think." Professor Quentis seemed pleased. "I'm proud of you, baby. No matter what happens, you've already accomplished more than I ever dreamed." Her words should have comforted me, but they carried an undertone of resignation that made my stomach clench. She expected me to fail, not because she didn't believe in me, but because failure was all she'd ever known. "I'm going to make it, Mom. This thesis is going to open doors." "I know you will," she said, but I could hear her folding laundry in the background, already moving on to the next task in her endless day. That week crawled by with agonizing slowness. I threw myself into my part-time job at the campus bookstore, organizing shelves and helping underclassmen find required texts. The bookstore felt like home in a way the rest of campus never quite did, familiar and unpretentious, filled with the comfortable chaos of knowledge seeking its readers. Thursday evening, Reed found me restocking the philosophy section. "You've been weird all week," he said, dropping his backpack by the returns cart. "Thesis anxiety," I admitted. "Quentis is supposed to give feedback tomorrow. It's going to be fine. Your work is always solid." Reed had a way of stating facts without emotion that usually calmed my nerves, but tonight it felt hollow. He didn't understand what was at stake for me, how this thesis represented not just a grade, but validation of everything I'd sacrificed to be here. "Easy for you to say. Your parents would still love you if you failed." The words came out harsher than I intended, and Reed's expression tightened. "That's not fair, Eliora. You're right. I'm sorry, I'm just scared." We stood there among the philosophy books, surrounded by centuries of human thought and wisdom, and I felt suddenly small and insignificant. What could I possibly add to the conversation that hadn't already been said by minds far greater than mine? "Want to grab coffee after I close?" "Up?" Reed asked. "I can't afford coffee. My treat." I almost said yes again, but something about accepting his charity, even casual kindness between friends, made my chest tight with shame. Rain check? I should get some sleep before tomorrow. Reed nodded, but his eyes held a question I wasn't ready to answer. How do you explain to someone who's never been hungry that pride becomes your last defense against a world determined to prove you don't belong? Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching my mood perfectly. I made my way to Morrison Hall with lead feet, trying to prepare myself for whatever Professor Quentis might say. Constructive criticism was fine, I could handle that. But what if he hated it? What if 18 months of work amounted to nothing? The hallway outside his office was empty except for Arden Silver, who leaned against the wall scrolling through his phone. Arden was everything I wasn't: confident, connected, casually wealthy in the way that made designer clothes look effortless. His father had donated enough money to the university to get a lecture hall named after their family. "Hey, Eliora," he said without looking up from his screen. "Waiting for Quentis too? Yeah, you. Thesis meeting?" He finally glanced at me, his smile friendly but distant. We'd shared exactly 3 classes over 4 years, and our interactions had been cordial but surface level. Arden moved in circles. I couldn't afford to enter. Professor Quentis's door opened, and he gestured for Arden to come in first. I caught a glimpse of papers scattered across his desk: student theses, mine among them. 20 minutes later, Arden emerged looking satisfied, giving me a casual wave as he headed toward the elevator. "Miss Mirelle?" Professor Quentis called. His office felt different this time, colder, more formal. My thesis lay open on his desk, but instead of the engaged enthusiasm I'd expected, his expression was carefully neutral. "Please, sit down." My heart started hammering as I settled into the chair across from his desk. This wasn't the tone of someone about to offer praise and encouragement. "I've reviewed your thesis thoroughly," he began, his fingers steepled in front of him. "And I'm afraid we have a serious problem." The world seemed to tilt sideways. What kind of problem? "Plagiarism, Miss Mirelle. Significant portions of your work appear to have been lifted from various online sources without proper attribution." The words hit me like physical blows. That's impossible. I wrote every word myself. I understand this is upsetting, but the evidence is quite clear. He turned his computer monitor toward me, showing a web page I'd never seen before. "This passage, for example, appears verbatim in your chapter 3. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring with shock and confusion. The words were indeed identical to a section I'd written about digital identity formation, but I had never seen this website before in my life. "Professor, I swear to you I've never plagiarized anything. I don't even know what site that is." His expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "I want to believe you, Miss Mirelle. Your previous work has always been exemplary. But I've run your entire thesis through plagiarism detection software, and the results are concerning." He handed me a printed report showing highlighted sections. Throughout my thesis, dozens of passages marked as potentially plagiarized from various online sources. My 80 months of original research and analysis reduced to a patchwork of supposed theft. "This has to be a mistake," I whispered, my hands shaking as I flipped through the pages. "Can I see the sources it's flagging?" Professor Quentis spent the next 30 minutes walking me through the alleged violations. Each one felt like a knife to the chest. Academic blogs I never heard of, research papers that supposedly predated my work, forum discussions I never participated in all, containing passages that matched my thesis word for word. "I don't understand how this is possible," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps you were taking notes from sources and forgot to mark them as such? It happens more often than you'd think, especially when students are under pressure." His tone was kind but condescending, the voice of an adult explaining obvious facts to a confused child. The implication was clear. I was either a deliberate plagiarist or too incompetent to keep track of my own research. "Professor, I keep meticulous notes. I always have. My citations are clean because I triple-check every source." "I understand. You're upset, but denying the evidence won't make this go away." The meeting ended with Professor Quentis explaining the university's academic integrity process. My thesis would be flagged for review by the Academic Standards Committee. My graduation would be postponed indefinitely. My scholarship, the only thing standing between me and massive debt, was under review. Walking across campus afterward felt surreal, like moving through a nightmare where familiar places had become foreign and threatening. Students laughed and chatted around me, completely unaware that my entire world had just collapsed. I made it to my apartment before the tears came huge, racking sobs that left me gasping for air on my bathroom floor. 4 years of sacrifice, of working until my hands cramped and my eyes burned, of choosing textbooks over food and education over comfort, all of it gone in one 30-minute meeting. But underneath the devastation, a small flame of anger began to burn. Something about this didn't add up. The plagiarism report was too comprehensive, too thorough. How had identical passages ended up scattered across random websites, all supposedly posted before I'd written my thesis? I pulled out my laptop and started investigating, beginning with the first flagged source. The academic blog claimed to have been updated 3 months ago, but when I checked the site's metadata, something felt off about the timestamps. That's small. Flame of anger grew brighter as I worked through the night, following digital breadcrumbs that led nowhere and raised more questions than they answered. Someone had set me up. I just had to prove it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under my apartment door like a death sentence wrapped in university letterhead. I'd been expecting it for 2 weeks, ever since my meeting with Professor Quentis, but seeing my name typed in official font above the words, Academic Standards Committee, still made my stomach drop to my knees. Dear Miss Mirelle, following a comprehensive review of your senior thesis submission, the Academic Standards Committee has determined that substantial portions of your work constitute academic misconduct in the form of plagiarism. Effective immediately, your thesis has been rejected, your graduation postponed indefinitely, and your university scholarship revoked. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated. Revoked, postponed indefinitely, academic misconduct. Each phrase felt like a physical blow, leaving me gasping on my kitchen floor with the letter crumpled in my fist. My phone buzzed with a text from, Mom, haven't heard from you in a few days. Everything okay? How do you tell your mother, who sacrificed everything so you could have chances she never did, that you've been accused of cheating? How do you explain that 4 years of her working triple shifts and skipping meals was all for nothing? I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I called the one person who might understand the technical side of what was happening to me. Reed answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. Eliora, it's 7 in the morning. I need your help, I said, my voice cracking. Someone framed me. There was a pause, then the sound of Reed sitting up in bed. What are you talking about? I explained everything: the plagiarism accusations, the websites that supposedly contained my words, the timestamps that didn't make sense. Reed listened without interrupting, his computer science brain processing the information in ways mine couldn't. You're saying someone planted content on various websites to make it look like you plagiarized? He asked when I finished. It's the only explanation that makes sense. But I can't prove it, and the committee won't listen to me. Have you tried reverse searching the content, looking at cached versions of those sites? I don't know how to do that. Another pause. Meet me at the library in an hour. Bring your laptop and all your research notes. The library felt different that morning, less like a sanctuary and more like a crime scene. Reed had claimed our usual table in the back corner, but instead of textbooks, his space was covered with printouts and sticky notes. He looked up when I approached, his expression serious. I've been thinking about this since you called, he said. If someone really did frame you, they'd need access to your thesis content before you submitted it. The implication hit me immediately. Someone in the department, or someone with access to the department's systems. When did you submit your thesis? 3 weeks ago. Professor Quentis said he'd review it over the following week. Reed opened his laptop and started typing. So whoever did this had at least 2 weeks to plant content and backdate timestamps. It's technically possible, but it would require serious planning. We spent the next 4 hours diving deep into the digital evidence. Reed showed me how to examine website metadata, check cached versions of pages, and trace domain registration. Information. What we found made my blood run cold. 5 of the 7 websites flagging my content had been registered within the past month. 3 of them were hosted by the same company. And most damning of all, several cached versions of the pages showed they'd been updated after my thesis submission date, despite claiming earlier publication. "This is deliberate," Reed said, his voice tight with anger. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to destroy your academic career. But who? And why?" Reed was quiet for a long moment, staring at the evidence spread across our table. "Eliora, I need to tell you something, but you have to promise not to do anything rash." My heart started pounding again. "What?" "I was in Morrison Hall last week, waiting to meet with Dr. Patterson about my senior project. I heard raised voices from Professor Quentis' office, him, and someone else arguing about thesis submissions. What were they saying? I couldn't make out all of it, but I heard your name. And I heard someone say, 'The Silver family donation is too important to risk.'" The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Arden Silver, his family's money, his thesis meeting the same day as mine. You think Arden plagiarized and they're using me as a scapegoat? I think someone with a lot of influence made sure the blame landed on someone who couldn't fight back. The anger I'd been nurturing for weeks exploded into full fury. I stood up so fast my chair nearly toppled over. I have to confront him. "Eliora, no." Reed grabbed my arm. "That's exactly what they expect you to do. Get emotional, make accusations you can't prove. Confirm their narrative that you're just a desperate student grasping at straws." He was right, but the injustice of it burned in my chest like acid. While I was working 3 jobs and surviving on ramen, Arden Silver was buying his way through university. When that wasn't enough, he destroyed my life to save his own reputation. So what am I supposed to do? Let them win? "We build a case," Reed said firmly. "Real evidence that proves what actually happened. But we do it smart, and we do it quietly." That afternoon, I walked across campus like a ghost. Students I'd known for years avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when I passed, and I caught whispered fragments of gossip following in my wake. ... Heard she stole her entire thesis. ... Always wondered how someone like her could write. So, well, ... double quotes. Double quotes ... proves. You can't trust scholarship kids. Each comment felt like a paper cut, small but cumulatively devastating. By evening, I understood how quickly reputation could turn from asset to weapon. Professor Quentis had been careful not to make any public announcements, but academic misconduct had a way of spreading through university networks like wildfire. My phone rang as I sat in my apartment, staring at rejection letters from graduate programs that had seemed so promising just weeks before. Mom's name flashed on the screen. "Hey, baby. Haven't heard from you all week." Her voice carried the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd been awake since 4 a.m., but also the warm concern that had carried me through every crisis of my childhood. "I'm okay, Mom. Just busy with finals. You sound tired. Are you eating enough?" This simple question nearly broke me. When had I last eaten a full meal? When had I last slept through the night without waking in a panic about my future? "I'm fine." "How are things at home?" "Same as always. Mrs. Chun from the bookstore asked about you yesterday. Wanted to know when you're graduating." The innocent question felt like a knife between my ribs. "Soon," I lied. We talked for 20 more minutes about safe topics, her latest shifts at the diner, the weather, plans for my graduation party that would never happen. Every word of normalcy made the contrast of my actual situation more stark. We hung up. I sat in the dark of my studio apartment and forced myself to face the full scope of what I was up against. This wasn't just about clearing my name or recovering my degree. The Silver family had enough influence to make me disappear from academic consideration permanently. Who would believe a broke girl from the wrong side of town over a respected donor family? But I sat there in the darkness, surrounded by 4 years of textbooks I could barely afford and dreams that felt increasingly impossible. Something hardened inside me. I thought about my grandmother's bookstore where she taught me that every story mattered, even the ones told by people without power or platform. I thought about my mother, who'd given up her art school dreams so I could have mine. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I thought about every first generation student who'd come after me, who deserved to know that hard work and honesty still meant something. The next morning, I found Reed in the computer lab, surrounded by printouts and energy drink cans. "I've been here all night," he said without looking up, "and I found something." He turned his monitor toward me, showing what looked like a complex network diagram. "Remember how I said someone would need access to your thesis before you submitted it?" "Yeah." "Well, I've been tracking digital footprints, and I found something interesting. 3 of the websites that flagged your content share the same hosting infrastructure. And that infrastructure, it's connected to a content creation service that specializes in academic writing." The implication was staggering. "You mean a ghostwriting service?" "More than that. I think I found where Arden's thesis actually came from." Reed pulled up another screen showing fragments of academic papers, all connected by similar writing patterns and identical citation formats. "These are all papers produced by the same ghostwriting service over the past 2 years. And look at this." He highlighted a section of text. "This paragraph appears in Arden's thesis, but it was originally written for a paper submitted to a completely different university last semester." My hand shook as I processed what Reed was showing. So Arden didn't just plagiarize from random internet sources. He bought an entire thesis from professional writers. And when the plagiarism detection software flagged his paper, someone with access to both submissions found a way to make it look like you were the one who plagiarized. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. This wasn't just academic misconduct, it was systematic fraud protected by money and influence. "Reed, this could destroy your career too. If they find out you're helping me ... He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, determined and slightly reckless. My dad always taught me that honor isn't about following orders. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's dangerous. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. Hope was dangerous in my situation, but with Reed's technical expertise and my stubborn refusal to accept injustice, maybe we had a chance. What do we do next? We build a case so airtight that even Judge Halstra will have to listen. I didn't know then how prophetic those words would prove to be. The next 3 weeks passed in a haze of methodical investigation and mounting paranoia. Reed and I developed a routine that felt like something between detective work and guerrilla warfare. We met before dawn in the library's computer lab when the building was empty except for security guards and the occasional insomniac student cramming for exams. My official status at the university had become a liminal nightmare. Not quite expelled, but barred from graduation activities. Not quite a student, but still technically enrolled pending the final committee decision. I walked through campus like a ghost, invisible to professors and avoided by classmates who'd once sought my help with their papers. The worst part was the whispers. Academic misconduct spread through university social networks faster than any legitimate research ever could. By the end of the first week, I'd overheard myself described as that scholarship girl who got caught cheating at least a dozen times. "You're becoming obsessed," Reed warned me on a Thursday morning as I hunched over my laptop, cross-referencing domain registration dates for the 10th time. "I prefer thorough," I replied, not looking up from my screen. We'd expanded our investigation beyond simple plagiarism detection. Reed had taught me basic digital forensics, how to trace IP addresses, examine website metadata, and identify patterns in content creation. What we discovered was far more sophisticated than either of us had initially imagined. The ghostwriting service, connected to Arden's thesis, operated under multiple business names across different states. They specialized in what they called academic consultation for students at elite universities, providing everything from minor editing to complete paper replacement. Their client list, which Reed had managed to partially access through some creative database searching, included students from at least 12 prestigious schools. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a pattern I noticed in the service's content. Every paper they produce includes these specific citation quirks and usual spacing, consistent formatting errors, and they always use Oxford commas even when the assignment doesn't require them. Reed leaned over my shoulder to examine the screen. Arden's thesis has all of those markers, along with 12 other papers submitted to various universities in the past 18 months. The evidence is mounting, but I knew it wasn't enough. Academic fraud was one thing, proving that university administrators had actively participated in covering it up was entirely different. We needed more than digital breadcrumbs. We needed someone to admit what had really happened. That someone appeared on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in the form of Dr. Sarah Hendricks, the literature professor who'd mentored me through my junior year. I found her in her office, grading papers with the kind of focused intensity I'd always admired. "Eliora," she said, looking up with genuine surprise, "I wasn't expecting to see you." Dr. Hendricks was everything Professor Quentis wasn't: unpretentious, direct, and genuinely committed to her students' success, regardless of their backgrounds. She'd grown up in a working-class family in Detroit and never forgot what it felt like to be the first person in her family to attend university. "I need to ask you something," I said, closing her office door behind me, "and I need you to be honest with me." Her expression grew serious. "What's this about? You've read my writing for 2 years. Do you believe I plagiarized my thesis?" Dr. Hendricks set down her pen and studied my face carefully. "Eliora, I can't discuss ongoing academic integrity proceedings." "I'm not asking you to discuss the proceedings. I'm asking what you believe." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her desk. Finally, she sighed. "No, I don't believe you plagiarized your work. Your writing has a distinctive voice and analytical approach that's developed consistently over time. The idea that you suddenly started stealing content doesn't align with anything I know about your character or capabilities." The validation felt like oxygen after weeks of suffocation. Then why won't anyone listen to me? Because academic politics are complicated, and sometimes factors beyond pure academic merit influence decision-making. Her careful phrasing told me everything I needed to know. Dr. Hendricks suspected the same corruption I was investigating, but her position in the department made it impossible for her to speak openly. If I could prove that my thesis was original and that someone else's work contained the actual plagiarism, would you be willing to review the evidence? Dr. Hendricks looked at me for a long time, and I could see her wrestling with institutional loyalty against academic integrity. "If you had compelling evidence, I would feel obligated to examine it thoroughly." That evening, I called Mom for the first time in over a week. I had been avoiding her calls, terrified that she'd hear the defeat in my voice, but the conversation with Dr. Hendricks had given me enough hope to risk the contact. "There's my busy college graduate," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. This simple assumption that I was still on track to graduate nearly broke my resolve to keep lying to her. "Mom, I need to tell you something." "What's wrong? You sound serious." I'd planned to ease into it, to find some gentle way to explain what was happening. Instead, the truth came pouring out in a desperate rush: the plagiarism accusations, the suspended graduation, the scholarship revocation, everything. Mom was quiet for so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Mom, are you there?" "I'm here." Her voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the barely contained fury underneath. "And I want you to listen to me very carefully." "Okay." "You are not going to let them destroy you. Do you understand me? I've watched you work yourself to exhaustion for 4 years. I've seen your dedication, your integrity, your refusal to take shortcuts even when everyone around you was cutting corners." Tears started streaming down my face. "But what if I can't prove it? What if they're too powerful?" "Then you make them work for it. You make them look you in the eye while they destroy an innocent person." And you document every step so that when the truth comes out, and it will come out, their corruption is undeniable. Her words lit a fire in my chest that had been dimming for weeks. This wasn't just about my degree anymore. It was about every student who'd been silenced by money and influence, every first-generation college attendee who'd been told they didn't belong. I love you, Mom. I love you too. Now go prove them wrong. The next morning, Reed and I shifted our investigation into higher gear. We'd been operating defensively, trying to prove my innocence. Now we went on the offensive, building a comprehensive case against the ghostwriting service and the university officials who'd protected its clients. Reed's computer skills proved invaluable as we traced financial connections between the Silver family and various university initiatives. What we found was a web of donations, consulting contracts, and informal influence that made Professor Quentis' protection of Arden look less like favoritism and more like financial necessity. Look at this, Reed said, pointing to a series of bank transfers. The Silver Foundation donated $2.3 million to the literature department over the past 3 years. That's more than the department's entire operating budget, making them essentially untouchable. Unless we can prove fraud so clearly that ignoring it would create legal liability for the university. We worked 16-hour days, surviving on coffee and determination. I stopped attending my other classes. What was the point when my graduation was already postponed? Instead, I poured every ounce of energy into building our case doc. The breakthrough came on a Friday evening when Reed discovered something that made both of us sit back in stunned silence. Eliora, you need to see this. He'd been analyzing the metadata from Arden's thesis submission when he noticed something unusual about the document's creation history. This file wasn't created on Arden's computer, Reed said, his voice tight with excitement. Look at the original author field. The document properties showed a username I didn't recognize. Academic Solutions _writer07. That's the ghostwriting service. I whispered. It gets better. Look at the revision history. Reed pulled up a detailed timeline showing every edit made to the document. The file had been created 6 months ago by Academic Solutions _writer07, edited extensively by 2 other users associated with the same service, and finally transferred to Arden's university account just 3 days before his submission deadline. He didn't even bother to clean the metadata, Reed said with something approaching admiration. Either he was incredibly careless, or he was so confident that his family's influence would protect him that he didn't think anyone would look this closely. We spent the weekend compiling everything into a comprehensive evidence package. Screenshots of plagiarism across multiple papers, financial connections between the Silver family and university decision-makers. Metadata proving Arden's thesis was produced by a commercial writing service, and detailed analysis of the planted evidence that had been used to frame me by Sunday evening. We had a 47-page report with footnotes, appendices, and enough supporting documentation to fill a banker's box. This is it, I said, staring at our completed work. This proves everything. Reed nodded, but his expression was troubled. The question is, who do we give it to? Professor Quentis is compromised. The Academic Standards Committee already made their decision based on false evidence. Dr. Hendricks said she'd review compelling evidence. That's a start, but we need someone with the authority to overturn the committee's decision. I thought about the university's power structure, trying to identify someone who might prioritize academic integrity over financial considerations. Then I remembered something Dr. Hendricks had mentioned in passing during office hours earlier. In the semester, the university ombudsman, I said. Dr. Martinez. She handles appeals of academic integrity decisions. Reed looked up Dr. Martinez's background while I drafted a formal complaint letter. What we found was encouraging. She'd built a reputation for thorough investigations and wasn't afraid to challenge department heads when evidence warranted it. She overturned 2 plagiarism decisions last year when students provided sufficient counter evidence, Reed reported. Then that's our next step. As I finished writing the letter requesting a formal review of my case, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks, hope mixed with genuine confidence. We had evidence. We had documentation. We had proof of systematic fraud that went far beyond my individual situation. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly powerful people could mobilize to protect their interests, or how dirty they were willing to fight to silence someone who threatened. They're carefully constructed lies. The war was just beginning. Dr. Martinez's office felt like stepping into a courtroom designed by someone who understood that justice required both formality and accessibility. The walls were lined with legal texts and university policy manuals, but her desk held a small succulent garden and photographs of students at graduation. Ceremonies, reminders that behind every case file was a human story. Miss Mirelle, she sighed, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. I've reviewed your initial complaint and supporting documentation. I must say, it's the most comprehensive appeal I've seen in 15 years as university ombudsman. Dr. Carmen Martinez was in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. She'd spent 3 decades in higher education administration, the last decade specifically focused on academic integrity cases. Her reputation for thoroughness was matched only by her reputation for absolute neutrality. Thank you for agreeing to review it, I said, my hands folded carefully in my lap to hide their trembling. I want to be clear about the process, Dr. Martinez continued, opening a thick folder labeled with my name. This is a formal investigation, which means I have the authority to interview witnesses, examine university records, and ultimately recommend actions up to and including complete reversal of the Academic Standards Committee's decision. Hope fluttered in my chest, but I forced myself to remain cautious. What does that mean in terms of timeline? These investigations typically take 4 to 6 weeks to complete. I know that's frustrating when your graduation and future are at stake, but thoroughness is essential for credibility. 4 to 6 weeks. Summer graduation would be long over by then, but at least there was a path forward. I understand. What do you need from me? Dr. Martinez spent the next hour walking me through the evidence Reed and I had compiled. She asked detailed questions about my research methodology, my note-taking habits, and my familiarity with the websites that had allegedly been the source of my plagiarism. Your technical analysis of the metadata is quite sophisticated, she observed. Did you conduct this research yourself? I had help from a friend who studies computer science. Reed Carmen. He taught me how to examine digital evidence. I'll need to interview Mr. Carmine as well. His technical expertise will be crucial for validating your findings. The meeting ended with Dr. Martinez explaining that she would be conducting a parallel investigation into Arden Silver's thesis submission. If our allegations were accurate, his case would need to be reviewed as well. I have to warn you, she said, as I prepared to leave. Investigations like this can attract significant attention from various stakeholders. You may find that people pressure you to withdraw your complaint. The warning proved prophetic faster than I could have imagined. That afternoon, I received an email from Professor Quentis requesting an immediate meeting. The tone was formal but carried an undertone of barely controlled anger that made my stomach clench. His office felt different than it had during our previous meeting, charged with tension and something that felt almost like hostility. Professor Quentis sat behind his desk like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. Miss Mirelle, I understand you filed a formal complaint with the Ombudsman regarding your academic integrity case. Yes, sir. I believe I was wrongfully accused. I see. His fingers drummed against his desk. And in pursuing this complaint, you've made serious allegations against the department, against me personally, and against another student. I've presented evidence of what I believe happened. Professor Quentis leaned forward, his expression hardening. Evidence that suggests I participated in some sort of conspiracy to protect a plagiarist while destroying an innocent student's career? Put so bluntly, the accusation sounded almost absurd. But I forced myself to hold his gaze. The evidence speaks for itself. The evidence, he said slowly, is the interpretation of a student facing academic consequences for her own poor choices. Miss Mirelle, I've been teaching for 22 years. My reputation in this field is unimpeachable. Do you really believe that anyone will take your word over mine? The question hung in the air like a challenge. He was right, of course. In any traditional credibility contest, a respected department head would triumph over a disgraced student from a working-class background. I believe the evidence will speak for itself, I repeated. Professor Quentis stood and walked to his window, looking out over the quad where students lounged in the afternoon sunshine. You know, Miss Mirelle, I've actually been quite concerned about your situation. A promising student making such a catastrophic error in judgment. It occurred to me that perhaps there were underlying factors we hadn't considered. I waited, sensing a trap, but unable to identify its shape. Financial stress, for instance. Working multiple jobs while trying to maintain academic performance. It's possible that you made some poor decisions out of desperation without really understanding the consequences. I didn't plagiarize my thesis. Of course, not intentionally. But perhaps in your exhaustion, you incorporated source material without proper attribution. Perhaps you lost track of your notes, confused your own words with those of others. He turned back to face me, his expression almost paternal. Here's what I'm prepared to offer. Withdraw your complaint with the ombudsman. Accept responsibility for poor academic practices. We'll arrange for you to retake senior seminar over the summer. Rewrite your thesis under close supervision and graduate in the fall with your class. The offer was designed to sound generous, but I could hear the threat underneath. Accept this. Face saving compromise or face the full weight of institutional opposition. And if I don't withdraw my complaint? Professor Quentis returned to his desk, his expression cooling. Then you'll have to live with the consequences of your choices. Academic misconduct findings follow students, Miss Mirelle. They appear on transcripts and recommendation letters, in background checks for graduate school and employment. You're threatening me. I'm offering you a way forward. But that offer won't remain open indefinitely. I left his office feeling like I'd been physically assaulted. The message was clear. Accept a lesser punishment and keep quiet, or be destroyed completely. That evening, I sat in my apartment staring at my phone, drafted messages to Dr. Martinez that I couldn't bring myself to send. Professor Quentis was right about the power imbalance. He had institutional credibility, tenure, and the backing of major donors. I had student loan debt and a reputation that was already in ruins. Reed found me there an hour later. Having let himself in with the spare key I'd given him for emergency library access. You look terrible, he said, dropping onto my couch. Quentis offered me a deal. Withdraw the complaint, accept a lesser punishment, graduate quietly in the fall. Reed was quiet for a moment. What did you tell him? That I'd think about it. And are you thinking about taking it? The question forced me to confront what I'd been avoiding all evening. Part of me wanted to take the deal desperately. It would end the uncertainty, the public humiliation, the constant fear of complete failure. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe he's right. Maybe fighting this is just going to make everything worse. Reed leaned forward, his expression serious. Eliora, do you remember what you told me about your thesis topic? Why you chose to write about digital narratives and personal truth? I nodded, confused by the apparent topic change. You said that technology was giving voice to people who'd historically been silenced. That digital platforms were democratizing storytelling in ways that traditional gatekeepers couldn't control. Yeah, so this is exactly what you were. Writing about powerful people using institutional authority to silence inconvenient truths. Traditional gatekeepers trying to control the narrative. His words hit me like a physical blow. He was right. Everything I've written about, everything I believed about the importance of giving voice to the voiceless. This was my chance to live those principles instead of just analyzing them. But what if we lose? I asked. What if all this evidence isn't enough? Then at least we'll lose fighting for something that matters. That night, I called Mom and told her about Professor Quentis' offer. What does your gut tell you? She asked after I'd explained the situation. That taking the deal means admitting I did something wrong when I didn't. Then you have your answer. But Mom, if I keep fighting and lose everything, baby, she interrupted. I've been working since I was 14 years old. I've had bosses try to cheat me out of wages. Landlords try to evict me for complaining about broken heating. Supervisors who thought a woman from my background should be grateful for any opportunity and keep her mouth shut. She paused, and I could hear her gathering her thoughts. Every single time I stayed quiet to keep the peace, I regretted it. Every single time I fought back, even when I lost, I could sleep at night knowing I hadn't betrayed myself. This could destroy my entire future. Honey, what kind of future are you going to have if you start it by accepting that powerful people can lie about you and you just have to take it? The next morning, I sent an email to Dr. Martinez confirming that I would not be withdrawing my complaint and asking how I could assist with her investigation. The response came faster than I expected. Professor Quentis had contacted her office requesting a meeting to discuss additional context regarding my case. The real battle was beginning, and I was about to learn exactly how ruthless academic politics could become when significant money and reputations were at stake. 3 days later, Reed burst into the library where I was working on a response to Dr. Martinez's latest questions. "We have a problem," he said, dropping into the chair beside me. "A big one." "What happened?" "I just got called into Dean Morrison's office." Apparently, someone filed a complaint against me for unauthorized access to university computer systems. My blood ran cold. What kind of unauthorized access? The kind we used to trace the ghostwriting service connections? They're saying I hacked into confidential academic records. Did you? Reed looked uncomfortable. I may have accessed some databases that weren't technically open to student users, but everything I found was information that should have been part of the original plagiarism investigation. They're coming after you because you helped me. It gets worse. Dean Morrison suggested that perhaps I should reconsider my involvement in your case. For my own academic good, the strategy was becoming clear. Isolate me by threatening anyone who supported my position. Attack the credibility of my evidence by claiming it was obtained through improper means. Reed, you should listen to him. This isn't your fight. The hell it isn't. His voice was sharper than I'd ever heard it. They're not just protecting a cheater. They're teaching every student on this campus that money and influence matter more than truth. That afternoon brought another escalation. I returned to my apartment to find an envelope from the university legal office. Inside was a cease and desist letter demanding that I stop making defamatory statements about Arden Silver and threatening legal action if I continued to spread malicious falsehoods. The letter was signed by a law firm I'd never heard of, but a quick internet search revealed they specialized in protecting wealthy families from negative publicity. I called Dr. Martinez immediately. "I've received similar correspondence," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "It appears that certain parties are trying to intimidate both you and this office from pursuing a legitimate investigation. Can they do that legally?" "They can try, but threats and intimidation don't change the facts of a case. If anything, this kind of pressure often indicates that someone has something significant to hide." What happens now? Now we continue the investigation with extra documentation of any attempts to obstruct or intimidate, and Miss Mirelle, I want you to save every email, every letter, every communication you receive related to this case. This kind of behavior speaks to consciousness of guilt. That evening, as I sat in my apartment reading through the legal threats for the dozenth time, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Some fights aren't worth winning. Consider your future carefully." I screenshot the message and added it to the growing file of evidence that this case was about much more than academic misconduct. Someone was very afraid of what Dr. Martinez's investigation might uncover, which meant we were on the right track. The letter appeared under my door. On a Wednesday morning, my name written across the envelope in Reed's careful handwriting. I almost didn't open it immediately after weeks of legal threats and administrative intimidation. Handwritten correspondence had become something to approach with caution, but there was something different about this envelope. Urgent, personal. The paper was expensive stationery, not the cheap notebooks Reed usually used, and the weight of it suggested multiple pages. Eli or a comma by the time you read this. I'll be in Dean Morrison's office confessing to academic misconduct. Not the computer access violations, they're threatening me with something much worse. Something that's going to change everything you think you know about what happened to your thesis. My hands started shaking before I finished the first paragraph. I've been trying to find the courage to tell you this for 3 weeks, ever since we started investigating the plagiarism accusations. Every day I watched you suffer, watched you fight for your reputation, knowing that I was the reason your life had been destroyed. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. You have to believe that the letter was 4 pages long, written in Reed's precise handwriting, and it systematically demolished every assumption I made about my situation. You remember when you almost asked me to proofread your thesis that night in the library? You said no, but I offered again the next morning, and you were so exhausted that you said yes. You gave me your flash drive and asked me to look for typos and formatting issues. I remembered, vaguely. The night before my thesis was due, Reed had offered to help with final proofreading. I'd been so tired that I gratefully accepted. What you don't know is that I copied your thesis file before returning your flash drive. Not to steal it. I swear that wasn't my intention. I was planning to use it as a model for my own thesis structure. Your writing was always so much better than mine, so much more sophisticated. I kept the file on my laptop for 2 weeks, trying to figure out how to organize my own research using your thesis as a template. I never planned to copy your content directly, but then my dad called Reed's father, the colonel who'd paid for his education and expected academic excellence in return. He'd been checking my grades online, and he saw that I was struggling with my senior project. He threatened to cut off financial support if I didn't bring my GPA up. Thought I was embarrassing the family, that he'd sacrificed too much for my education to watch me fail. I panicked, Eliora. I had 3 days to submit a completely rewritten thesis, and I couldn't think clearly. So I opened your file, thinking I'd just borrow some of your organizational strategies. My stomach dropped as I realized where this was heading, but your research was so closely related to my topic. Digital identity, technology platforms, narrative. Control, all the same themes I was supposed to be exploring. And your arguments were so much more sophisticated than anything I could produce in 3 days. So I started copying paragraphs. Just a few at first, thinking I'd rewrite them later. But then I copied sections, then entire chapters. By the time I submitted my thesis, probably 60% of it was your work. The room spun around me. Reed, my closest friend, my ally in fighting the plagiarism accusations, had been the actual plagiarist all along. I told myself I'd confess after graduation, that I'd find a way to make it right without destroying both our futures. But then your thesis got flagged for plagiarism, and I realized what must have happened. The plagiarism detection software found matches between our 2 submissions. But instead of flagging both of us, someone in the department made a decision about which student to investigate. The scholarship girl with no family connections, or the student whose father was a decorated military officer. I watched them destroy your reputation to protect mine, and I was too much of a coward to speak up. The letter went on to explain how. Reed had spent the past 3 weeks wrestling with guilt while helping me investigate what we thought was a conspiracy against me. How every piece of evidence we gathered, every theory we developed about art and silver and the ghostwriting service, had been built on a foundation of lies, the metadata analysis, the financial connections, the planted evidence theory I helped. You build all of it because I was desperate to believe there was some other explanation. Some way this could be true without making me the villain of your story. But there is no conspiracy, Eliora. There's just me, destroying my best friend's life because I was too weak to face my father's disappointment. The final page contained what Reed called his confession timeline, a detailed account of exactly when and how he plagiarized my work, along with documentation he planned to submit to Dean Morrison. I know this destroys any chance of our friendship surviving. I know it probably destroys your faith in your own judgment about people. But I can't let you keep fighting a battle that's already lost against enemies who don't actually exist. Your thesis was brilliant and original. You deserve to graduate with honors, to go to graduate school, to have the academic career you've worked so hard for. I stole that from you, and no amount of guilt or confession can give it back. I'm sorry, Eliora. For all of it. Read, I read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. Reed had plagiarized my work. The university had blamed me instead of him. Everything we discovered about academic corruption was real, but it was protecting. Reed, not Arden, Sylver. My phone was ringing. Dr. Martinez. Miss Mirelle, I need you to come to my office immediately. We've had a significant development in your case. I know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Reed confessed. You've spoken with Mr. Carmine? He left me a letter. Dr. Martinez, I feel like such an idiot. I've been fighting the wrong battle this entire time. Miss Mirelle, I understand this is shocking, but I need you to come in so. We can discuss the implications of Mr. Carmine's confession for your case. The walk across campus felt surreal. Students moved around me in the normal rhythms of academic life, carrying backpacks, laughing with friends, complaining about upcoming exams. None of them knew that my entire understanding of the past month had just imploded. Dr. Martinez's office felt different this time, less like a courtroom and more like a triage center. Reed sat in one of the chairs across from our desk, his head in his hands. He looked up when I entered, his eyes red and exhausted. Eliora, he started, but I held up a hand to stop him. Don't. Not yet. Dr. Martinez gestured for me to sit in the chair next to Reed, close enough that I could feel the tension radiating from him. Mr. Carmine has provided a detailed confession. Regarding the plagiarism of your thesis, she began. He's also provided documentation supporting his account, including the original file transfer logs from his laptop. She turned to Reed. Mr. Carmine, would you please repeat for Miss Mirelle what you told me about the department's handling of the plagiarism detection? Reed's voice was barely audible. When both our theses were flagged by the software, Professor Quentis called me into his office first. He said there appeared to be substantial overlap between my submission and yours and asked if I could explain it. And what did you tell him? I panicked. I said I'd helped you with research and editing, and that maybe you'd accidentally incorporated some of my preliminary work into your final draft. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Reed stolen my work, but when confronted about it, he'd thrown me under the bus to save himself. Professor Quentis accepted this explanation? Dr. Martinez asked. He seemed relieved to have a simple resolution. My father had made significant contributions to the Veterans Scholarship Fund, and I think Quentis preferred to believe that I was the victim rather than the perpetrator. Dr. Martinez turned to me. Miss Mirelle, given this new information, how would you like to proceed with your complaint? I stared at Reed, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd done. Not just the initial plagiarism, but the weeks of letting me believe I was fighting for justice while he knew he was the one who destroyed my academic career. I need to understand something, I said slowly. Reed, when you were helping me investigate, when you were teaching me digital forensics and tracking down evidence, what was going through your mind? He finally met my eyes. I kept hoping we'd find something that would prove you were innocent without making me the guilty party. Some third explanation that would let us both be victims. And when that didn't happen, I thought maybe if we could prove some larger pattern of corruption, your case would get lost in the bigger scandal. That somehow I could save your reputation without destroying my own. The casual selfishness of it was breathtaking. He'd been willing to let me fight phantoms indefinitely rather than face the consequences of his own actions. Why confess now? I asked. Reed looked down at his hands. Because last night I realized that watching you suffer was destroying me more than my father's disappointment ever could. And because you deserve better than building your recovery on a foundation of lies. Doctor? Martinez intervened before I could respond. Miss Mirelle, Mr. Carmine's confession completely exonerates you of any academic misconduct. Your thesis was entirely original work that was plagiarized by another student. I'll be recommending immediate reinstatement of your degree, restoration, of your scholarship, and inclusion in summer graduation ceremonies. The vindication should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt hollow. I'd been proven innocent, but at the cost of discovering that my closest friend had been willing to destroy my life to protect his own comfort. What happens to Reed? I asked. Mr. Carmen will face the Academic Standards Committee for plagiarism. Given the severity of the offense and the attempt to blame another student, he'll likely face suspension or expulsion. Reed nodded like he'd expected this outcome. I've already contacted my father. He's flying in tomorrow to meet with the dean. How did he take the news? About like you'd expect. But honestly, the disappointment in his voice was nothing compared to what I've been feeling about myself. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of destroyed trust heavy between us. Eliora, Reed said quietly, I know this doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know that your friendship meant everything to me. More than my grades, more than my father's approval, more than my degree. That's why this ate me alive for so long. If it meant so much to you, I said, why did you let me suffer? Because I'm a coward. Because I was raised to believe that. Failure was worse than dishonor. Because I convinced myself that somehow this would all work out without anyone getting hurt. He paused, looking directly at me. But mostly because once I started lying, every day made it harder to tell the truth. Dr. Martinez concluded the meeting by explaining the next steps for clearing my record and processing Reed's misconduct case. As we prepared to leave, she pulled me aside. Miss Mirelle, I want you to know that your investigative work over the past month was quite impressive. You demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking and research skills that make for an excellent graduate student. Thank you. Though I feel pretty stupid for missing the obvious answer. The obvious answer was hidden by someone you trusted. That's not a failure of intelligence. It's a betrayal of friendship. Walking across campus afterward, Reed and I found ourselves moving in the same direction despite having nothing left to say to each other. Finally, as we reached the intersection where our paths would diverge, he stopped. I know you can't forgive me, he said. But I need you to know that helping you investigate was the most honest thing I've done in months. Even though I was lying about the source of the problem, everything I did to help you was real. I looked at him, this person who'd been my closest friend and my inadvertent destroyer, and felt something more complicated than anger. Reed, the worst part isn't even the plagiarism. It's that for 3 weeks you watched me blame myself. Watched me question my own memory and integrity, and you said nothing. I know. You let me think I was crazy. You let me think the entire academic system was conspiring against me. I know, he repeated, his voice breaking slightly. The person who did that isn't someone I ever really knew. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing at the intersection with the weight of his choices. That evening, I called Mom to tell her the news. So you were right all along, she said after I'd explained everything. You didn't plagiarize your thesis. But Mom, I was wrong about everything else. I spent a month investigating the wrong person, building conspiracy theories that didn't exist, trusting someone who was lying to my face. Honey, you were lied to by someone you cared about. That doesn't make you stupid, it makes you human. I feel like I should have known. Like there should have been signs. The only sign was that Reed was helping you too much. And in your situation, you needed all the help you could get. She was quiet for a moment. Besides, you weren't wrong about the important thing. You knew you didn't cheat, and you refused to accept punishment for something you didn't do. That took more courage than most people ever show. Later that night, I sat in my apartment staring at the thesis that had caused so much chaos. 147 pages of my original research and analysis, now vindicated but forever connected to betrayal and loss. Tomorrow I would start the process of reclaiming my academic career. I would graduate with my class, apply to graduate programs, begin building the future I'd always planned, but I would do it alone. having learned that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones capable of the deepest betrayal. And sometimes the truth you're fighting for isn't the truth that will set you free. The official letter from Dean Morrison arrived on a Friday morning, printed on university letterhead with all the bureaucratic gravitas that academic institutions used to make their pronouncements feel weighty. In final dot, Dear Miss Mirelle, following a comprehensive review by the University Ombudsman and subsequent investigation by the Academic Standards Committee, all findings of academic misconduct have been officially rescinded from your record. Your thesis has been accepted with distinction. Your scholarship has been reinstated retroactively, and you are cleared to participate in summer graduation ceremonies scheduled for August 5th-10th. The university acknowledges that you were subjected to unwarranted accusations and extends its formal apology for any distress the situation may have caused. Sincerely, Dean Patricia Morrison. The letter was everything I'd fought for, but holding it felt strangely anticlimactic. After weeks of battling what I thought was institutional corruption, the actual resolution felt almost mundane, a form letter that reduced my entire ordeal to unwarranted accusations and any distress this situation may have caused. What the letter didn't mention was that Reed had been suspended for the remainder of the semester, pending a formal plagiarism hearing. It didn't mention that Professor Quentis was now under review for his handling of the original investigation. And it certainly didn't mention that my faith in my own judgment had been shattered, along with a friendship I'd valued above almost everything else. Dr. Martinez had scheduled a follow-up meeting to discuss what she called closure procedures. Basically, a formal debriefing to ensure I was satisfied with the investigation's resolution, and to address any remaining concerns. Her office felt familiar now, like a battlefield where I'd fought and won, but at a cost I was still calculating. How are you feeling about the outcome? She asked after I'd settled into my usual chair. Relieved, vindicated, confused, angry. I paused, trying to organize the tangle of emotions I'd been carrying for days. Honestly, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to feel. That's understandable. Being betrayed by someone you trusted is often more traumatic than the original injustice. Dr. Martinez had a way of cutting straight to the heart of complicated situations that I'd grown to appreciate. Over the past month, the thing is, I continued, Reed wasn't entirely wrong about the system protecting him over me. If he hadn't confessed, would anyone have investigated deeply enough to discover the truth? That's a fair question, and one that speaks to larger issues in how academic misconduct cases are handled. She leaned forward, her expression serious. Miss Mirelle, I want you to know that your case has prompted a comprehensive review of our academic integrity procedures. Specifically, how initial investigations are conducted when plagiarism detection software finds matches between student submissions. What kind of review? Protocol changes that require investigating all students involved in potential plagiarism cases, regardless of their personal circumstances or family connections. Documentation requirements for faculty decisions about which students to investigate first, and mandatory bias training for anyone involved in academic misconduct proceedings. It was more than I'd expected actual systemic change prompted by my experience. But it also felt like closing the barn door after the horses had escaped. That's good, I said. But it doesn't help me figure out what to do now. What do you mean? I'd been thinking about this question for days, ever since Reed's confession. Had appended everything I thought I knew about my situation. I spent a month investigating what I thought was corruption. I built this detailed case against Professor Quentis and Arden Silver. I accused them of conspiracy and fraud. But they were innocent, and I was wrong about everything. You were wrong about the specific details, Dr. Martinez corrected. But you were right about the larger pattern. Professor Quentis did make assumptions based on student backgrounds rather than evidence. The system did protect a privileged student at the expense of a vulnerable one. But not intentionally, not as part of some grand conspiracy. Does intention matter more than impact? The question stopped me cold. I'd been so focused on being wrong about the specific mechanism of injustice that I'd overlooked the fact that injustice had definitely occurred. I need to think about that, I admitted. Dr. Martinez smiled. I think you'd make an excellent graduate student, Miss Mirelle. Your analytical thinking has improved dramatically over the past month. Assuming I can get into graduate school with this mess on my record. Actually, I have some good news about that. I've taken the liberty of contacting the graduate programs you applied to earlier this year. Given the circumstances, several have agreed to reopen your applications for fall admission. Hope fluttered in my chest for the first time in weeks. Really? The University of Chicago was particularly interested. Apparently, your thesis on digital narratives addresses exactly the kind of research they're looking to support. The University of Chicago? My dream program, the one I never thought I had a realistic chance of getting into. They want to interview you next week if you're interested. The meeting ended with Dr. Martinez providing me with contact information for the graduate programs and a timeline for resolving the remaining administrative details of my case. As I prepared to leave, she offered one final piece of advice. Miss Mirelle, I know this experience has shaken your confidence and your judgment about people, but I want you to consider that the qualities that made you vulnerable to Reed's deception, loyalty, trust, willingness to see the best in others, are also the qualities that made you fight so hard for truth and justice. Even when I was fighting for the wrong truth, especially then. You refused to accept injustice, even when powerful people told you to stay quiet. That's not a character flaw to overcome, it's a strength to cultivate. That afternoon, I found myself walking across campus, with no particular destination in mind. Summer session had started, and the quad was filled with a different energy, fewer students, more intensive course loads, the focused atmosphere of people trying to accomplish specific goals in compressed timeframes. I ended up at the library, at the table where Reed and I had spent so many late nights working on our respective projects. Someone else was sitting in his usual spot, a young woman hunched over a statistics textbook, surrounded by the familiar detritus of academic struggle, empty coffee cups, highlighters, and a slightly desperate look of someone trying to absorb too much information too quickly. She looked up when I approached, probably wondering why I was staring at her workspace. Sorry, I said. I used to sit here a lot. Just feeling nostalgic. Oh, you're graduating, she asked. Eventually. Maybe in August. Congratulations. I'm Sarah, by the way, rising sophomore. Eliora, hopefully graduating senior. Something about her earnest enthusiasm reminded me of myself. 2 years ago, determined, slightly overwhelmed, but fundamentally optimistic about what education could accomplish. What are you studying? I asked. Pre-law. I want to work in civil rights eventually. That's ambitious. My dad always says that if you're not aiming high enough to risk failure, you're not aiming high enough to succeed. The simple wisdom of it hit me like a revelation. I'd been so focused on being wrong about the specific details of my case that I'd lost sight of the larger principle I'd been fighting for. The idea that truth and justice were worth pursuing even when the odds were stacked against you. Maybe I had been wrong about Professor Quentis and Art and Silver. Maybe Reed's betrayal had been personal rather than institutional. But the investigation I conducted, the evidence I gathered, the questions I'd asked, all of that had still mattered. Good luck with your studies, I told Sarah. Thanks. And congratulations again on graduating. Walking home, I made 2 decisions. First, I was going to accept the interview with the University of Chicago and pursue the graduate program I'd always wanted. Second, I was going to use my experience, both the injustice I'd suffered and the investigation I conducted, as a foundation for my graduate research. Not because I wanted to relitigate my personal situation, but because academic misconduct cases were happening to students across the country every day. Some were probably guilty, but others were likely victims of the same biases and assumptions that had initially protected Reed at my expense. That evening, I called Mom to tell her about the graduate school opportunity. Chicago, she repeated. That's far from home. 3 hours by train. I could come back on weekends. Eliora, I don't want you making decisions based on staying close to me. This is your chance to build the life you've always wanted. But what about you? You've sacrificed so much. Baby, she interrupted. Watching me succeed is not a sacrifice. It's the point of everything I've done. We talked for another hour about practical details, how graduate school funding worked, what living in Chicago would be like, whether I was emotionally ready to start over somewhere new after everything that had happened. You sound different, Mom observed as we prepared to hang up. Different how? Stronger. Like, you've been through something terrible and come out the other side knowing you can handle whatever comes next. She was right. The past month had broken. Something in me, my naive faith that hard work and good intentions were always enough to ensure justice. But it had also built something new. A deeper understanding of how institutions actually functioned, and how individual courage could sometimes force systemic change. The next morning brought an email from Professor Quentis requesting a meeting. The subject line read personal apology, and the tone was formal but considerably more humble than our previous communications. I almost deleted it without responding. What could he possibly say that would matter now? But curiosity won, and I agreed to meet him that afternoon. His office felt different this time, smaller somehow, less intimidating. Professor Quentis looked older than I remembered, the events of the past month having carved new lines around his eyes. Miss Mirelle, thank you for agreeing to see me. What did you want to discuss? He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing. Near his door, I owe you an apology. A real one, not the bureaucratic language the university used in their letter. Okay. When Mr. Carmen suggested that you might have incorporated his work into your thesis, I accepted that explanation too. Readily. I made assumptions based on factors that had nothing to do with academic merit, such as... Professor Quentis was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with how much honesty to offer. Your background, your need for financial aid, your friends, family connections. He met my eyes directly. I assumed that desperation might lead to poor judgment, and that privilege was a marker of integrity. That's a pretty damning admission. Yes, it is. And it's cost me considerably in terms of professional reputation and personal self-respect. I waited for him to continue. I also want you to know that your investigative work over the past month was quite impressive. The connections you made, the evidence you gathered, the systematic way you approached the problem. It demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking we try to foster in our best students. I was wrong about almost everything. You were wrong about the specific perpetrators, but you were absolutely right about the existence of bias in academic justice processes. Your case has forced this entire department to examine our assumptions and procedures. Professor Quentis reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder. I've written a letter of recommendation for your graduate school applications. It focuses on your intellectual courage, your research abilities, and your commitment to justice. I hope you'll consider allowing me to submit it. The offer was unexpected and complicated. Part of me wanted to reject it outright. Why would I want a recommendation from someone who'd wrongly accused me? But another part recognized that his public support might carry significant weight with admissions committees. Why? I asked. Because destroying a promising student's career based on bias and assumptions is not something I can live with quietly. This is one way I can try to make amends. I took the folder from him and skimmed the letter. It was 2 pages of detailed praise for my analytical abilities, research skills, and personal integrity. No mention of the plagiarism accusations or the investigation that followed. This is really generous, I said. It's really accurate. Miss Mirelle, you have the potential to be an outstanding scholar. Don't let 1 month of injustice derail what could be a remarkable academic career. As I prepared to leave his office, Professor Quentis offered one final comment. I understand that you've been invited to interview at several graduate programs. Whatever you decide to study, I hope you'll consider research that examines how institutions can better serve justice and equity. Actually, I said, that's exactly what I'm planning to focus on. The interview with the University of Chicago was scheduled for the following Monday, and I spent the weekend reviewing my thesis, practicing responses to likely questions, and mentally rehearsing how to discuss my recent experiences without sounding bitter or obsessed with personal grievances. Sunday evening, as I laid out my interview clothes and reviewed my notes one final time, I realized that the past month had fundamentally changed my relationship to academic success. I still wanted to excel, but now I also understood that excellence wasn't just about individual achievement. It was about using knowledge and analytical skills to identify and address systemic problems that affected vulnerable people. My thesis on digital narratives had been about giving voice to the voiceless. Now I had a chance to live that principle. Through research that might help other students avoid what I'd experienced. The phone call from Reed came at 9 p.m., just as I was getting ready for bed. I know you probably don't want to talk to me, he said when I answered. You're right, I don't. I just wanted you to know that I've officially withdrawn from the university. I'm not waiting for the plagiarism hearing. Okay, and I wanted to apologize one more time. Not because I expect forgiveness, but because you deserve to hear it. I was quiet for a long moment, trying to decide whether engaging with him would be healing or harmful. Reed, I need you to understand something. The plagiarism was bad, but what really destroyed our friendship was the lying. Watching me suffer while you knew the truth, that's what I can't get past. I know, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. What are you going to do now? I'm enlisting. Military service, like my father always wanted. Maybe I can learn something about honor and integrity that I clearly never picked up in civilian life. It felt like an appropriate ending. Reed returning to the structured environment where his father's values had shaped him, hopefully learning to apply them more honorably than he had at university. I hope that works out for you, I said, and I meant it. Eliora? For what it's worth, you're going to be amazing at whatever you choose to do next. You have more integrity and courage than anyone I've ever known. After I hung up, I sat in my small apartment surrounded by boxes of books and papers, the physical remnants of 4 years of academic work that had nearly been destroyed by someone I trusted. Tomorrow I would interview for a graduate program that could launch the career I always dreamed of. Next month I would graduate with my class, vindicated and ready to move forward. But tonight, I was just grateful to have survived a battle I never should have had to fight, armed with knowledge about myself and institutions that would serve me. Well, in whatever battles lay ahead, the truth had indeed set me free. Even if it wasn't the truth I'd expected to find. The phone call came on a Thursday morning while I was folding laundry in my studio apartment, trying to distract myself from the anxiety that had been building since my interview 3 weeks earlier. The University of Chicago admissions office had said they'd notify students by the end of July, and today was July 29th. Miss Mirelle? This is Dr. Rebecca Santos from the University of Chicago Graduate School of Social Thought. My heart stopped completely. Dr. Santos had been part of my interview. Panel, a brilliant scholar whose work on institutional bias in educational settings had directly influenced my thesis research. Yes, this is Eliora. I'm calling with very good news. The committee has voted unanimously to offer you admission to our program beginning this fall. We're also pleased to offer you a full fellowship that covers tuition and provides a living stipend. The words took a moment to penetrate. Full admission, full fellowship. Starting in September. Miss Mirelle, are you there? Yes, sorry. This is incredible news. Thank you so much. Actually, I wanted to speak with you personally because your case has sparked some interesting discussions among our faculty. Your experience with academic misconduct allegations, and particularly your response to that challenge, demonstrates exactly the kind of critical thinking and institutional analysis we value in our program. Dr. Santos went on to explain that they were particularly interested in my proposed research on bias in academic justice systems. Several faculty members had expressed willingness to work with me on developing this into a comprehensive study that could inform policy changes across multiple universities. We see your personal experience not as a liability, but as valuable lived knowledge that can enhance your scholarly perspective, she concluded. After I hung up, I sat on my couch in stunned silence for several minutes. 3 months ago, I'd been a struggling senior convinced my academic career was over. Now I was heading to one of the most prestigious graduate programs in the country, with full funding and faculty eager to support research born directly from my recent ordeal. The first person I called was Mom. The University of Chicago called, I said when she answered, and I got in full fellowship. They want me to start in September. The silence on the other end lasted so long I wondered if the call had dropped. Mom, I'm here, baby. I'm just crying too hard to talk. We spent the next 20 minutes laughing and crying and making plans. Mom would take time off work to help me move to Chicago. We'd drive together in my beat-up Honda, making a road trip out of what would be the biggest transition of my life. I'm so proud of you, she kept repeating. So proud of how you fought for yourself when everyone told you to give up. The second call was to Dr. Martinez, who had become something of a mentor over the past month. That's wonderful news, but not surprising, she said. Your interview was quite impressive, from what I heard. You heard about my interview? Dr. Santos called me for a reference. I told her that in 15 years as university ombudsman, I'd never worked with a student who demonstrated such systematic analytical thinking under extreme pressure. Thank you for that. I also told her that your case had resulted in concrete policy changes here and that your proposed research could have national significance. Dr. Martinez paused, then added, Eliora, I hope you'll remember that what happened to you here wasn't just about your individual situation. You have an opportunity now to make sure other students don't face the same kind of institutional bias. That's exactly what I'm planning to research. Good. The Academy needs scholars who understand how power operates within educational institutions. That afternoon, I found myself walking across campus one last time as an undergraduate. In 6 weeks, I'd be packing up my apartment and driving north to Chicago. This place that had been my home for 4 years, that had nearly destroyed my future, and that had ultimately launched me toward opportunities I'd never dared imagine. I ended up at the library. Not because I had research to do, but because it felt like the right place to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Sarah, the pre-law student I met a few weeks earlier, was sitting at what used to be my table. She looked up when I approached. Eliora, how did your graduate school applications turn out? I got into Chicago. Full fellowship. Her face lit up with genuine excitement. That's amazing. You must be so relieved. Relief doesn't begin to cover it. I told her the abbreviated version of my story, the plagiarism accusations, the investigation, the eventual vindication, and the research opportunities that had emerged from the entire ordeal. So your worst experience became the foundation for your future career? Sarah asked. It looks that way. That's like something out of a movie, I laughed. Trust me, it didn't feel cinematic while I was living through it. It felt like everything I'd worked for was being destroyed by forces I couldn't understand or control. But you kept fighting. I kept fighting. Even when I was fighting for the wrong thing, I kept fighting. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the story. I think that's what courage actually looks like, she said finally. Not knowing you're right, but refusing to accept injustice anyway. Her words stayed with me as I walked home that evening. Sarah was right. Courage wasn't about certainty or perfect knowledge. It was about standing up for principles even when the outcome was uncertain. That evening brought an unexpected visitor. Professor Quentis knocked on my door just as I was starting dinner, a celebration meal of something more substantial than ramen for the first time in months. I hope I'm not intruding, he said. I heard about Chicago. Good news travels fast. I wanted to congratulate you personally and to give you this. He handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a first edition copy of James Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son. I thought you might appreciate it for your graduate studies. Baldwin wrote extensively about the relationship between personal experience and social analysis. It was a thoughtful gift and an expensive one. I ran my fingers over the worn cover, thinking about the irony of receiving such a meaningful present from someone who had wrongly accused me just months earlier. Professor Quentis, can I ask you something? Of course. What would have happened if Reed hadn't confessed? If he'd let me take the blame permanently? Professor Quentis looked uncomfortable, but he answered honestly. I don't know. The evidence you and Mr. Carmen compiled was compelling, but it would have been difficult to overcome the initial plagiarism findings without his confession. So I might never have been vindicated. It's possible. And that's something I'll have to live with, the knowledge that my biased initial investigation could have permanently destroyed an innocent student's career. We stood there in my small apartment, the weight of that admission hanging between us. Thank you for being honest, I said finally. Thank you for fighting back. Your resistance forced all of us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we make decisions. After Professor Quentis left, I sat with Baldwin's book and thought about the strange trajectory of the past 3 months. I'd been betrayed by my closest friend, wrongly accused by my professor, and nearly destroyed by an institution I trusted, but I also discovered reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. I'd learned to investigate complex problems systematically. I'd forced institutional changes that would benefit future students. And I'd turned my personal ordeal into the foundation for research that could have broader social impact. Most importantly, I'd learned that fighting for justice, even imperfectly, even when you're wrong about the details, was worth doing. The formal letter from Chicago arrived 2 days later, full of bureaucratic language about enrollment procedures and fellowship requirements. But tucked inside was a handwritten note from Dr. Santos. Eliora, I wanted you to know that several faculty members are already excited about the research you proposed. Your combination of personal experience and analytical rigor promises to bring fresh perspective to questions that have vexed our field for years. We look forward to welcoming you to Chicago in September. Best regards. Rebecca Santos. The note felt like validation, not just of my academic potential, but of the entire ordeal I'd endured to reach this point. That weekend, Mom drove down from home to help me start packing. We spent Saturday afternoon boxing up 4 years of textbooks, notes, and papers, the physical artifacts of my undergraduate education. You know what strikes me about all this? Mom said as we wrapped my thesis in bubble wrap. What? 6 months ago, you were just trying to graduate and maybe get into graduate school somewhere. Now you're going to one of the best programs in the country with a research agenda that grew directly out of fighting for yourself. It's been quite a journey. Baby, this isn't the end of the journey. This is the beginning. You're about to start learning how to use your voice on a much bigger stage. She was right. Graduate school would give me the tools and platform to research institutional bias systematically, to propose policy changes based on empirical evidence, to ensure that other students facing similar challenges had better resources and protections. My personal battle had become the foundation for what I hoped would be a career fighting systematic battles. Sunday evening, as Mom prepared to drive home, we stood outside my apartment building looking up at the university buildings where so much drama had unfolded. Are you angry? She asked. About what Reed did, about what you went through. I thought about the question seriously. Was I angry? I'm angry about the lying, I said finally. About being betrayed by someone I trusted. But I'm not angry about the fight itself. Fighting taught me things about myself that I never would have learned otherwise, such as that I'm stronger than I thought. That truth is worth pursuing even when it's complicated. That institutions can change when people refuse to accept injustice quietly. Mom smiled. Those are good things to know about yourself. Yeah, and now I get to spend the next several years learning how to apply those insights more broadly. As our car pulled away, I realized that this moment standing outside my apartment building, holding an acceptance letter to my dream program, surrounded by boxes containing 4 years of academic work, represented the real climax of my story, not the moment when Reed confessed, or when Dr. Martinez cleared my name, or when Professor Quentis apologized. Those were plot points. This was the moment when I understood that everything I'd been through had prepared me for something larger than personal vindication. I was ready to begin the work I was meant to do. The morning of August 15th dawned clear and humid, typical of Illinois summers, but somehow feeling more significant because it marked the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another. I woke up in my mostly empty apartment, surrounded by boxes labeled Chicago and the few remaining items I'd need for the next 3 weeks before moving to graduate school. Mom had driven down the night before, and we'd spent the evening walking around campus one final time, visiting all the places that had shaped my undergraduate experience. The library where I'd spent countless late nights, the bookstore where I'd worked to pay rent, Professor Quentis's office where I'd been wrongly accused and eventually vindicated, Dr. Martinez's office, where I'd learned to fight institutional battles systematically. You look different, Mom observed as we sat in her hotel room that morning, sharing coffee and donuts from the campus convenience store. Different how? Older, more confident. Like someone who's been tested and passed. She was right. The person putting on her graduation gown that morning was fundamentally different from the terrified student who'd been accused of plagiarism 4 months earlier. I'd learned things about resilience, about institutional power, about the difference between being right and being heard. The graduation ceremony was held on the quad, with families clustered in folding chairs under a canopy of ancient oak trees. I spotted Mom in the audience, wearing the dress she'd bought specially for this day, navy blue with small flowers, simple but elegant dot as we lined up in alphabetical order. I found myself standing near several classmates I'd known for 4 years, but hadn't spoken to since the plagiarism accusations surfaced. Their reactions ranged from cautious friendliness to obvious discomfort, and I realized that some version of the story had become part of campus folklore. Eliora? The voice belonged to Jessica Martinez, a literature major who'd been in several of my classes. Hey, Jessica. I heard about what happened with your thesis, and about Chicago. That's incredible. Thank you. I also heard that your investigation led to some policy changes in the department. I nodded. Academic integrity procedures are being revised to address bias in initial investigations. That's amazing. You turned a terrible situation into something that will help other students. It was the first time someone had explicitly acknowledged the broader significance of what I'd been through, and it felt surprisingly validating. The ceremony began with the usual academic pomp processional music, administrative speeches about the value of liberal arts education, and remarks from the student speaker about the challenges and opportunities facing our generation. When Dean Morrison took the podium to announce the graduating class, I felt a complex mix of emotions. This was the same administrator who'd signed the letter accusing me of academic misconduct and also the one who'd signed my official vindication. Before we begin conferring degrees, Dean Morrison said, I want to acknowledge that this year's graduating class faced unprecedented challenges in maintaining academic integrity and pursuing justice within our institutional systems. She was speaking generally, but I knew she was referring at least partially to my case. Our students demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of adversity, and their courage has led to meaningful improvements in how this university handles academic misconduct allegations. Scattered applause rippled through the audience. Mom caught my eye from her seat and gave me a thumbs up. When my name was called, Eliora Mirelle, Bachelor of Arts in Literature, magna cum laude, I walked across the stage with my head high, shaking hands with Dean Morrison and accepting my diploma. Congratulations, Miss Mirelle, she said quietly. And thank you for making this institution better. The handshake felt like an epilogue to the entire ordeal, formal acknowledgement that the battle was over, and that both sides had learned something valuable from the conflict. After the ceremony, Mom and I found each other in the crowd celebrating. Families, how does it feel? She asked, examining my diploma like it was a precious artifact. Surreal. Like I should feel more victorious, but mostly I just feel ready to move on to the next challenge. That sounds about right. Victory is usually quieter than people expect. We were interrupted by Dr. Martinez, who approached with someone I didn't recognize, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and an academic bearing. Eliora, I'd like you to meet Dr. Linda Chun from Northwestern University. She's been following your case with interest. Dr. Chun extended her hand with a warm smile. Miss Mirelle, I've heard remarkable things about your investigative work and your upcoming research at Chicago. Thank you. What's your connection to all this? I chair Northwestern's Academic Integrity Committee, and we're currently revising our procedures based partly on lessons learned from your case here. She went on to explain that word of my situation had spread through academic networks, prompting multiple universities to examine their own policies for handling plagiarism allegations. Your experience has become something of a case study in how unconscious bias can influence academic justice processes, Dr. Chun continued. Several institutions have reached out to Dr. Martinez for consultation on policy revisions. I looked at Dr. Martinez, who nodded confirmingly. Your case has had impact far beyond this campus, she said, which I hope makes some of the pain you endured feel more meaningful. It did. The idea that my personal ordeal might prevent other students from facing similar injustices gave weight to everything I've been through. The afternoon reception was held in the Student Center, with families mingling over cake and punch while graduates said goodbye to classmates and professors. I found myself in conversation with Dr. Hendricks, the literature professor who had quietly supported me during the investigation. I heard Chicago offered you full funding, she said. That's quite an achievement. It feels like a new beginning. It is, but don't forget that you're entering graduate school with research experience that most students take years to develop. Your investigation was essentially an independent study in institutional analysis. She was right. The skills I'd learned during those desperate weeks of trying to prove my innocent systematic research, evidence analysis, questioning authority, building persuasive arguments were exactly the tools I'd need for graduate-level research. Dr. Hendricks, can I ask you something? Of course. When you first heard about the plagiarism accusations, did you believe them? She considered the question carefully. No, your writing had always been too distinctive, too clearly connected to your personal voice. But I also knew that my belief wouldn't matter unless you could prove your innocence systematically. Is that why you encouraged me to fight back? I encouraged you to fight back because accepting injustice, even when fighting seems hopeless, changes who you are as a person. I didn't want to see that happen to you. The conversation was interrupted by an unexpected arrival Reed, wearing a military dress uniform and looking uncomfortable but determined. Eliora, he said quietly, could I speak with you for a moment? Dr. Hendricks excused herself diplomatically, leaving Reed and me standing near the refreshment table amid the celebration chaos. I almost didn't come, he said. But I couldn't let you graduate without saying something in person. What did you want to say? That I'm proud of you. For fighting back, for winning, for turning the whole experience into something that will help other people. He looked different in uniform, older, more serious, but also somehow more honest than he'd been during our friendship. I also wanted you to know that what I did taught me things about myself that I didn't want to know. About how easily I could rationalize betraying someone I cared about when my own comfort was at stake. Reed, let me finish. I know I destroyed our friendship permanently, but I also want you to know that watching you fight for truth, even when I knew you were wrong, about the details, was the most inspiring thing I've ever witnessed. We stood there for a moment, surrounded by celebrating families and graduating students, two people whose lives had been fundamentally altered by choices made during a few crucial weeks. I hope military service teaches you what you're looking for, I said finally. It already has. Structure isn't enough if you don't have principles to structure your life around. And do you have principles now? Reed smiled sadly. I'm working on it every day. As he walked away, I realized that our conversation felt like genuine closure, not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that we'd both been changed by what had happened between us. The reception wound down as afternoon, moved toward evening. Families began loading cars with graduation paraphernalia and preparing for long drives home. Mom and I found ourselves sitting on a bench outside the student center, watching the campus empty out. What are you thinking about? She asked. Everything. How different this day could have been if Reed hadn't confessed. How different I am now compared to 4 months ago. Are you happy with how things turned out? I considered the question seriously. Was I happy? I'm grateful, I said finally. Grateful that the truth came out. Grateful for the opportunities I have now. Grateful that something good emerged from something so painful. But not happy. I'm satisfied. Which feels more mature than happiness. Mom laughed. That's very mature of you to say. I learned a lot about myself during this whole ordeal. About how I respond to crisis. About what I value most. About what I'm willing to fight for. And what did you learn? That I'm stronger than I thought. That truth is more complicated than I used to believe. That institutions can change, but only when people refuse to accept the status quo quietly. As we prepared to leave campus for the final time, I took one last look at the buildings, where I'd spent 4 years learning to think critically about literature, society, and justice. In 3 weeks, I'd be starting graduate school in Chicago, beginning research that would examine how institutions could better serve equity and fairness. My personal experience with academic injustice would become the foundation for scholarship that might prevent other students from facing similar challenges. Ready to go? Mom asked, ready? The drive back to my apartment was quiet, both of us, processing the significance of the day. As we passed the library where I'd spent so many late nights, the bookstore where I'd worked to pay bills, the administrative buildings where I'd fought my battles, I felt a sense of completion that was deeper than simple relief. I'd survived my trial by fire. More than that, I had used the experience to discover capabilities I didn't know I possessed. 3 months later, I was sitting in a graduate seminar at the University of Chicago, presenting preliminary research on bias and academic misconduct. Proceedings. My professor, Dr. Santos, listened intently as I outlined a study design that would examine hundreds of plagiarism cases across multiple universities, looking for patterns in how initial investigations were conducted. Your personal experience clearly informs this research, commented another graduate student. How do you maintain scholarly objectivity given your emotional investment in the topic? It was a fair question, and one I'd been thinking about since beginning the program. I think personal experience can enhance rather than compromise scholarly analysis, if it's handled carefully, I replied. My lived knowledge of how these processes feel from a student perspective gives me insights that pure theoretical analysis might miss. Dr. Santos nodded approvingly. Eliora's point speaks to a larger methodological question about the value of experiential knowledge in social research. After class, Dr. Santos pulled me aside to discuss my progress. Your research proposal has attracted attention from several policy organizations, she said. There may be opportunities to present your findings to university administrators as you develop them. Really? Your case has become something of a touchstone for discussions about academic justice reform. People want to hear what you've learned. 6 months after graduation, I received an email from Sarah, the pre-law student I'd met in the library during my darkest period. She was now a junior, actively involved in student government, and working on a proposal to create a student advocacy office that would assist people facing academic misconduct allegations. Eliora, I wanted to let you know that your story inspired me to get involved in academic justice issues here on campus. We're proposing to create an office that would provide students with resources and guidance when facing misconduct allegations. I kept thinking about what you said. That courage means fighting for principles, even when you don't know if you'll win. That's what we're trying to do. Hope you're thriving in Chicago. Sarah reading her email, I realized that my story had rippled out in ways I'd never anticipated. Students I'd never met were applying lessons from my experience to their own activism. A year after graduation, I returned to Millbridge University to present my research findings to the Faculty Senate. Dr. Martinez had invited me to speak about policy recommendations based on my analysis of academic misconduct procedures at multiple institutions. Walking across campus felt strange familiar, but also distant, like visiting a place where you used to live, but no longer belonged. My presentation went well. Faculty members asked thoughtful questions about implementation timelines and resource requirements. Several thanked me for turning my personal experience into scholarship that could benefit the broader academic community. After the presentation, I found myself walking past the library where so much of my story had unfolded. The same tables were occupied by stressed students working on papers and projects, probably unaware that their academic justice protections had been strengthened, partly because of battles fought in the same space. Professor Quentis approached me as I stood outside the building. Eliora, thank you for coming back to share your research. Thank you for inviting me. I wanted you to know that the policy changes you recommended have been implemented here. We've also used your case as a teaching example in our faculty development workshops. How so? As an illustration of how unconscious bias can influence professional judgment, and how institutional courage sometimes means admitting when we've made serious mistakes. It felt like the fullest possible resolution, my experience being used not just to prevent future injustices, but to help faculty develop better decision-making frameworks. That evening, I had dinner with Mom at the diner, where she'd worked night shifts to support my education. She was down to just one job now. The bookstore had expanded and hired her as assistant manager, finally giving her stable hours and benefits. How does it feel to be back? She asked. Like closing a circle. When I was fighting for my innocence, I never imagined that the experience would become my career focus. Are you glad it happened? All of it? I thought about the question carefully. Was I glad to have been betrayed by my closest friend, wrongly accused of academic misconduct, and forced to fight institutional bias? I'm glad I learned what I learned about myself, I said finally. I'm glad the experience led to my research. I'm glad other students will face better procedures because of what I went through. But you're not glad it happened. No, I wish I could have learned those lessons some other way. But I'm grateful for how I responded when it did happen. 2 years later, my research was published in a major academic journal and cited in policy documents at universities across the country. I'd become something of an expert on academic justice reform, regularly invited to speak at conferences and consult with institutional review committees. But the moment that felt most significant came during my second year of graduate school, when I received a handwritten letter from a student at a university I'd never heard of. Dear Ms. Mirelle, I'm writing to thank you for the research you published on bias in academic misconduct cases. Last month, I was wrongly accused of plagiarism by a professor who made assumptions about my background and capabilities, but because of policy changes that were influenced by your work, I had access to an advocate who helped me challenge the accusations systematically. The charges were dropped after a thorough investigation. I wanted you to know that your courage in fighting your own case probably saved my academic career. Gratefully, Maria Santos, reading that letter, understood that my story had achieved something beyond personal vindication. The institutional changes that emerged from my experience were protecting students I would never meet, preventing injustices that might otherwise have destroyed academic dreams. My thesis defense was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in April, exactly 3 years after the plagiarism accusations that had nearly ended my academic career. Dr. Santos and my committee had spent the morning grilling me on methodology, theoretical frameworks, and policy implications of my research. But when they asked their final question, what do you hope your research will accomplish? I found myself thinking not about academic publications or conference presentations, but about students like Maria Santos and Sarah Chen, people who were using the tools and protections that had emerged from my ordeal. I hope it prevents future students from having to fight the battles I fought, I said. But more than that, I hope it demonstrates that individual courage can create institutional change, even when the odds seem impossible. The committee deliberated for 20 minutes before calling me back into the room. "Congratulations, Dr. Mirelle," Dr. Santos said with a smile. "Your dissertation has been approved with distinction." Dr. Mirelle, after everything I've been through, I was finally ready to claim that title. That evening, I called Mom to share the news. "Dr. Mirelle," she repeated, testing how the words sounded. "I like it. It feels surreal. Like the end of a very long journey." "Baby, this isn't the end of the journey. This is the beginning of the part where you get to use everything you've learned to help other people." She was right, of course. My PhD was not an endpoint, but a credential that would allow me to continue the work that had grown out of my undergraduate. Ordeal: 3 months later, I accepted a position as assistant professor of education policy at a major research university, with a mandate to continue my research on institutional bias and academic justice reform. On my last day in Chicago, I packed up my apartment and loaded everything into a rental truck for the drive to my new position. Among my belongings was a small box of artifacts from my undergraduate experience, Dr. Martinez's case file, the acceptance letter from Chicago, the letter from Maria Santos, and my original thesis, the document that had started everything. As I drove out of the city that had given me the tools to transform personal adversity into professional purpose, I thought about all the students who would benefit from the policies and protections we'd fought to establish. My name was now Dr. Eliora Mirelle, and I had work to do. The judge had laughed at me when I was 23, convinced I didn't belong in his courtroom or any space where truth and justice mattered. But I brought the evidence anyway. And in the end, the evidence had changed everything, not just for me, but for countless students who would never have to fight the battles I'd fought. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that prevent future battles from being necessary. And sometimes the courage to fight for yourself becomes the foundation for fighting for everyone who comes after you. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.